The white plate sat like an altar, rim traced in pale gold, linen napkin folded into a precise triangle, a single sprig of parsley placed with the same deliberation Henry Cole used to place numbers on spreadsheets and signatures on foundations. He had been taught, early and thoroughly, that the right arrangement of things made the world behave. It was a small theater of control, no sound but the soft scrape of silverware, no distraction but the city glassed into blue beyond the window. His life had been ordered into surfaces that never bore fingerprints. Then a hand touched the tablecloth. It was small, darker than the polished hands that usually lifted his cutlery, and bafflingly it fit in a world that had never been designed for her. She did not knock. She did not ask permission. She had come up the glass stairwell, past the coat check, through the polite churn of diners whose conversations folded themselves into the clink of glasses, the way a foreign element folds its own voice inside a room and softens. She stepped in, cheeks streaked with whatever had been smeared there by lack of a parent's hand, eyes so wide as if they were making up for years of not being seen. "Daddy?" she said, and the room blurred. It was the wrong voice, but the right name, like a key that fit a lock Henry had long since stopped trying. The syllable lodged under his ribs, and for the first time in a long while he felt something that wasn't protocol or calculation. The manager moved before Henry did. She moved with the certainty of someone who had never needed to hesitate, stern jaw, voice like a register closing. "You can't, sir, you can't be feeding children that aren't guests," she said, the not-so-soft subtext being, "This is not our problem. This is not your problem." The girl's hoodie was too big. A frayed bear was stitched on with uneven thread that gave the toy a limp smile. She looked at Henry like the world still believed in the possibility of kindness. "Daddy, I'm so hungry. Can I eat with you?" Her voice was as small as a pebble dropped in a pond and made long ripples. The manager's face arranged itself into an excuse. "You have to leave. We don't allow loitering. I'll call security." In the picture of his life, Henry had been careful about what he allowed through doors. He had laws and clauses, floors of offices, a calendar of philanthropic gestures that rarely touched the messy business of people's actual lives. He had perfected the restraint of distance. He kept promises on paper, because paper did not ask for presents. He watched the manager shepherd the child toward the exit. The girl's grip tightened on the table edge, as if trying to anchor herself to something that did not drift away. She looked back at him as the doorway swallowed her. "Please," she said. It was the same word the manager and the security guard ignored. When Henry stood, the fork made a moist, polite sound against the plate. He folded his napkin and left the napkin where it had been. Once he crossed the room, he did not rearrange the world to make his choice more comfortable. He moved in a way that surprised him, kinetic, abrupt. People in the dining room moved around him like tide. Some watched with the thinly veiled interest reserved for those who like to witness the currency of scandal. Some averted their eyes, protective of the bubble of their own safeties. Henry followed the shrinking shape of the girl down the hall. At the doorway she staggered briefly as the light shifted. On instinct he reached and steadied her shoulder. Her body was bone light against his hand. There was a burn mark at the edge of her cheek, faded like a secret map. The manager's hand was already on the girl's shoulder, but Henry's voice cut through the choreography of dismissal. "She stays with me," he said. "Sir, we can't," the manager began. He did not argue. He ignored the manager's insistence that rules were rules. He bent down so his face was level with hers, because a child's world is measured in faces and not in ledgers. "Are you hungry?" he asked. He had not counted on his voice sounding small, like he had learned to speak from people who did not expect to be heard. Her answer was a whisper, "Yes, I'm hungry." When she agreed to sit at a table with him, the room inhaled and released, like a held breath deciding to stay. Henry ordered something simple: soup, bread, a grilled cheese torn into pieces just small enough for tiny fingers. He watched the way she ate, cautious, as if testing whether the bite would vanish, whether the pleasure of warmth would be taken from her as quickly as it arrived. She smiled when the soup touched the corner of her lips, and it took Henry a long moment to realize he had not remembered the texture of such a smile in years. Across the table, he found himself mimicking the small movements, breaking bread, offering it, waiting for a nod. Then the manager returned, this time with a posture that belonged to people who knew how to turn pity into policy. "We called for assistance. There are protocols for unaccompanied minors." Henry put down his spoon. He did not want a scene. He had never liked them. But what he disliked even more was the settling of their eyes on the child's misfortune, as if she were a cautionary tale to be consumed in whispers. "She's with me for now," he said. The manager's mouth twitched. The word "sir" hung in the air like a garnish of entitlement. Henry did not bracket it. Security arrived, stern, efficient, smelling faintly of aftershave and resolve. They asked questions not about the girl's hunger, but about identification. The girl repeated in a shrill, flat panic, "Daddy!" And the security guard's eyes narrowed, as if to evaluate the weight of truth in a child's pronouncement. Outside, a line of guests conferred in small clusters. Then the first blow came. A hand, too quick and practiced, pulled the girl's elbow. She braced with a sound that could have been fear or pain. Henry's world telescoped to the smallness of her body and the immediate injustice of someone assuming ownership of it. His hand closed around the security guard's wrist. The world stilled. He felt, for the first time in decades, a motor in his chest trip a different gear. Instinct, not calculation. What happened next was not cinematic in any manufactured sense. It was sharp and ordinary and utterly consequential. Henry did not think about his name, his station, the inevitability of headlines. He thought only of the small hand that had touched his napkin, and the way the manager had arranged herself into a wall between the child and the rest of the room. He stepped in, and that step reoriented the room. They left the restaurant with a sense of awkwardness. Henry did not want an argument, but neither would he watch the child be shepherded away. He called a car. He wrapped his coat around her shoulders with a clumsy tenderness he had not known he owned. She looked up at him and said simply, "Thank you." The word was bright and brave and reverberated in him in a way that made no financial sense. Outside, the city smelled like rain-pressed asphalt. The taxi's window fogged with breath. The child's hoodie swallowed her smallness. She slept in the car with her head on his knee, an act so small and so enormous that Henry felt the old geography of his life shift. He thought of a son he had lost, Eric, more as an abstract absence than a person, until a photograph tucked in a drawer sighed into presence. He had promises made on paper and payouts that perpetuated his public image. He had given to needy causes as one might give to an elegant problem, from a distance, efficiently. This child, in a way he could not name, had claimed something of him that numbers had never touched. At the emergency entrance, the city hospital smelled of antiseptic and human impatience. The triage nurse took the child's temperature, asked the routine questions that assumed adult guardianship. Henry said his name, more out of habit than conviction. He signed forms he did not read. He answered questions with the kind of exactness the privileged learn early: precise dates, stable addresses, reliable phone numbers. When the nurse asked if he was the parent, he hesitated. The moment he hesitated, the past uncoiled. The doctor who met them, Dr. Patel, was calm and practiced in a way that made the room an instrument of care. He spoke softly to the girl, eyes softening as he examined the scrape on her forehead, the patches of scab at the knees, the way her small hands curled when someone reached to touch them. He recommended blood work, a medical screen, a forensic swab as part of standard procedure when a child is found without guardianship and there are signs suggesting potential neglect. He did not dramatize the tests. He explained them like someone who had spent years bridging the science of care with the ethics of survival.
"It's standard," he said. "We make sure you're healthy and safe." The swab felt invasive to Henry only in the sense that it made the child's presence formal. A cotton stick into the child's cheek, tagged and labeled. Henry had been through processes that involved signatures and lawyers and the neutral language of forms that made the human world legible to systems. This was the rawer version, proof of blood, of line. While they waited for initial results, the child's name came out like a small stone dropped between them. "Mila," she whispered when asked. She said it as if naming herself made the world hold on a second longer. Marjorie, Henry's longtime housekeeper, who had once been part of his son's life like moss on a stone, arrived at the hospital because Gregory had called her first, like he called old maps when the terrain changed. When Marjorie entered the bright room, Mila's face brightened with something that felt like recognition, not of a person, but of the warmth in a woman who scraped bread and folded sheets and had once smelled faintly like home. Henry's phone buzzed, an old voicemail from Eric that prefaced a time in his life when choices had been gentler. In the message, Eric laughed against the half-heard sounds of a crowded apartment and said he'd be home soon. The memory of that simple sentence hit Henry so hard it was like a physical ache, a reminder of how many small promises had been shelved as time and business grew into one another. He listened to the message again and tightened his fist at the seat of his pants, where the leather felt too familiar. He had been close to his son, and not close enough. Absence, it turned out, was an accumulative thing, made up of missed breakfasts and unread texts and the slow acquiescence to the comfortable fiction that love could be discharged in gifts. "What does the swab prove?" Henry asked Dr. Patel. It was not curiosity so much as a defense. If a line of blood could be read, maybe the rest of the living could be assigned its proper place. Dr. Patel took the envelope with the lab slip, and his voice narrowed into the professional rhythm that was meant to keep private wounds contained. "The swab will tell us if there's a biological relation that needs to be considered. We also have to report unaccompanied minors to Child Protective Services. It's protocol to ensure the child's safety." The words biological relation had the geometry of a legal clause, not of the living. Yet the suggestion that Mila might be connected to his blood shifted something in Henry's chest like tectonic plates. A name had been mentioned by Gregory in a flurry earlier, Eric's. The possibility felt both like debt and redemption. When the initial tests came back, they were inconclusive in the way of hurried hospital tests. Henry paced the corridor, the hospital's bright lights, the muted tones of televisions in vacant waiting areas, and the quiet clicking of keyboards.
He thought of the photograph in his study, the young man with his father's jaw and his mother's soft eyes, carrying a guitar that never found a stage. He had not kept every promise to his son. Some had been postponed into a ledger of later. The ledger had a smell to it now, like dust on books. He felt the weight of all the late apologies he had not said. He wanted badly to retreat, to buy the girl another meal, to return her to the streets, and let the city's cold be someone else's problem. There existed in him an option to pay for the simile of relief, a trust fund, a monthly donation, and continue living in the curated stillness of his habits. Then he looked at the child again. She was coloring with a felt tip, pressing hard as if to make the marks hold. Her drawing, a lopsided house and a sun with too many rays, was held up for him. "House," she said, proudly. "You live here?" she asked, pointing at the skyscraper in his mind. "Yes," he said, and the word felt both right and terrible. Gregory arrived then, his friend, head of security, a man who had been at Henry's shoulder through quiet failures and simple successes. Gregory's presence was a low, steady function. He did not ask why. He offered logistics. He had already started to look into the girl's provenance, the route by which she had reached the restaurant. He talked in the clipped language of someone who organizes information into maps of risk. "There's a woman reported with groups of kids, Tasha Price. She's been named in complaints before," Gregory said, in a tone that assumed the next step was to remove nodes of harm. Henry's first reaction was the one he had practiced for years: compartmentalize. Let the security apparatus do its work. Let the lawyers preen their feathers. Let the press be contained. Yet, as Gregory spoke, Henry felt something else, the recognition that doing nothing had been his longest habit. He had invested in causes from the height of distance. He had dense reports and glossy brochures that stood in for touch. Standing in the hospital corridor, his palms warm from holding the small scarred hand, he sensed a fracture forming in the architecture of his life. When the lab called with the preliminary notice, an automated voice that made the news of blood sound bureaucratic, Henry's chest rose. There was a pause as the technician typed, and then a human voice. "We have a match to an existing sample. We'll need confirmation, but there is a high probability of genetic relation." Henry stared at the sterile tile, and the world rattled in its hinges. To be related was to be accountable in a way money could not soften. The word grandfather tasted like an accusation and an opportunity both. It demanded adjacency. It demanded actions without the distance of a trust fund. Dr. Patel explained the medical next steps with procedural calm. If the child was to be temporarily placed in Henry's care, there would be forms, a thorough screening, Child Protective Services interviews, a social worker assigned. The hospital would not release the child to an unvetted adult without the involvement of the proper authorities. Henry's lips pressed together. He did not want to be a name on a form. He wanted to be the person who took responsibility. At the station, where documentation took shape and fingerprints and signatures became a story, Henry felt the old world and the new one grind against each other. Gregory suggested filing for temporary guardianship through emergency channels. The lawyers would have to be engaged quickly, and the company, if Henry made a public declaration, would have to be told delicately. There would be optics to consider, the press, the board, the donors. Everything he had built could tilt on a sentence he issued to a reporter. He felt the tug to prioritize the institution over the human in front of him. But he found himself saying, with more conviction than he had expected, "I want her with me." The sentence carried the weight of both an admission and a plan. "Sir, you understand this is complicated," said a social worker, a woman whose badge read Holloway, Mrs. Cynthia Holloway, the head of a nearby school, and, as Henry would later reflect, one of the city's quieter bulwarks against neglect. She spoke as someone who knew policy and had seen how the machinery of care could both help and fail a child. We need to ensure it's in her best interest. There will be interviews, medical clearances. We must be thorough. Henry had expected resistance. The resistance that arrived was not moralism, but procedure. It was the bureaucracy of safety. It was, Henry realized, exactly the band of governance he had never respected because it had never knocked at his door. Now it did. Marjorie sat beside them with a cup of hospital coffee, the kind that warmed hands but not souls. She put hers into the child's small hands as if to teach her the ritual of warmth. "You like it here?" she asked the child, in that steady voice that had once led toys from box to bed with a grandmother's authority. The child's response was immediate and luminous. "It feels strong." That line lodged somewhere that would not let go. Henry thought of all the buildings he had commissioned, all the names on plaques, the foundations set up in his son's memory, strongness as brand rather than practice. He felt for the first time the need to translate his public language into the private labor of small actions. Gregory sent out quiet messages to old contacts, people who worked the streets in different ways, informal networks, who knew the names of residents and transient caregivers. He found a pattern. Tasha Price, the reported handler, had been seen moving children between neighborhoods, trading small goods for clothing and bread, promising shelter in empty rooms.
There were complaints on the edges of official complaint forms, notes scribbled by exhausted workers that had not become the kind of noise the city elected to hear. Henry did not like what he found. He did not like that money had been his method of distance. He did not like that systems designed to protect had waited too long to act on small alarms. He did not like that his son's name might be one of the connections that had been overlooked. "Do we know if she's related to Eric?" Henry asked Gregory in a voice that ached in places he had long kept numb. "There's a preliminary match," Gregory said. "Full confirmation will come from the lab." He looked at Henry as if to capture the degree to which the man was hauling himself into a life that would be different and public in ways he had not prepared for. "If it's true, we need a plan that protects the child and doesn't just put her under your name as a headline." Henry swallowed. He was not naive. He had made public declarations before and meant them at the time. He had also used public statements to close down more complicated responsibilities. Now, in the hospital's fluorescent light, he felt the outline of responsibility as a thing that required presence. Not a donation, not a named chair on a board, but actual presence. There was a moment then, like a hinge turning, where past and present met in the shape of a photograph pulled from his wallet. Eric at 18, hair unruly against a wind, freckles along the nose, a crooked grin. Henry had promised his son many small and large things and had failed. He had promised protection and had been absent. The photograph was a confession when he looked at it. He turned the picture over in his fingers as if the paper could be softened into time travel. In the creases, the promise he had shelved was not incentive enough. It was a command. He filed the emergency guardianship papers 2 days later with Mrs. Marion Hayes, the family court attorney who had handled discreet, delicate matters for his family for years. The courthouse waited the way courthouses always did, with the muffled grind of clerks and the faint smell of old books. Henry sat across from Mrs. Hayes and felt the gravity of entering a room that could not be bought with the kind of money he wielded. The law required proof of presence and intent. He had to sign his name in ink that would not be washed away by press conferences.
Marion Hayes did not give him platitudes. She gave him the measurable steps: background checks, social worker reports, evidence that he could provide stable care. He provided bank statements only because the law sometimes deems stability in decimal points, and a record of his history as a legal guardian in corporate structures, not in family life. The papers in front of him looked like a map of his shortcomings and the route to repair. "Emergency guardianship is now provisional," Marion said.
"We have to show we are acting in the child's best interest until the hearing. That includes cooperating with CPS and allowing assessments." Henry consented. Being grandfathered now felt both like an admission and a challenge. He had resources. He had, perhaps, the ability to convert them into immediate security. But he also had pride and a company that would not uniformly bend to his personal priorities. The conflict came in private conversations, emails between board members and his executive assistant that phrased his choice as a potential distraction. For Henry, the distraction was a translation. The world he had organized into places of power would have to make room for a life that demanded proximity. In the quiet hours that followed, Henry learned to do things he had previously delegated. He boiled an egg until its center held the kind of semi-firm warmth children preferred. He read a story aloud without skipping to the tidy moral at the end. He learned to lift a small body into a bed and sit by it long enough for a child's breathing to become the metronome of a domestic peace. Mila, the name he repeated as if he were tasting a new language, began in small ways to anchor the house. She traced the lines on the coffee table with a stub of crayon, and when Henry came into the kitchen the next morning, she had made a paper crown and declared him king of pancakes. Those first tentative rituals were not theatrical. They were mess and real labor. He burned 3 pancakes before learning their precise flip. He folded bedsheets until his hands cramped. He left a voicemail for Mrs. Holloway, asking if there was a place where Mila could be enrolled in a program. He found himself apologizing to people with whom he had once only signed checks. He stepped down, for reasons he could articulate poorly, from some of his daily duties at the company, appointing an interim CEO he had trained for years. The board grumbled in low voltages, donors cleared their throats, but Henry felt, astonishingly, that a complaint of a board was a small noise compared to the sound of a child calling him in the dark. At the office, controversy unfurled like a thin smoke. Journalists began to sense a narrative, the billionaire touched by a child's plea. Some wanted spectacle, some wanted scoop. Henry's communications team counseled restraint, no statements beyond the necessary. He learned how to issue brief facts that could not be called into question, that he had filed for guardianship, that he was cooperating with authorities, that the company would continue to operate under interim leadership. He learned quickly and painfully that not every action must be explained to the public. Some are acts of private responsibility, not PR. Gregory, meanwhile, did the slow, precise work of tracking down Tasha Price. The network she was part of was not a well-defined cartel the newspapers would later make into a cliché of villainy. It was a patchwork of complicity and neglect, landlords who turned a blind eye, small-time traffickers who treated children as currency, neighbors who felt terror in silence. Gregory's operation was not the stuff of vigilante fantasy. It involved lists, phone calls, and the clinical choreography of timing with law enforcement. Henry watched from a distance, a man unaccustomed to the gritty lines of his own life,
learning to direct people into action without making the action about his ego. He also began to understand that rescue was not a theatrical absolution. In the hospital's pale rooms, Dr. Patel had explained that trauma's effects did not resolve with a single day of shelter. There would be nights Mila was unable to sleep. There would be moments when she flinched at loud voices, or when the smell of frying would make her subside into a memory that cut. Henry learned slowly that his wealth could buy comfort, but not erase the work of healing. That work required presence, repetitive acts of reassurance that could not be scheduled as line items in a book. On the day the lab called, Henry stood in his kitchen with a thin envelope in his hand. The DNA results slid into his life with the systematic blandness of an official sheet of paper, a printout from a lab that matched genetic markers to a sample on file. The words were clinical, but they refracted into personal consequence. There was a high probability that Mila was Eric's daughter. The room shrank. The list of things to be done was suddenly intimate and immediate. He could not transfer this into the tidy realm of philanthropy. It was not a line on a tax return. It was a small human body that needed custody, guardianship, and the constancy of daily care. He did what he had avoided for years. He went to the small, cramped boxes in the back of a closet where he kept the personal things he had been too busy to curate. The leather photograph case felt like a relic. Inside was a picture of Eric holding a small girl at a park, no more than a little girl in a striped dress, hair in two perfect braids, a smile like his father's. It was the photograph he had seen before, and that he had, in other times, framed in a way that made the grief tidy. This time, the image turned his grief into responsibility. He signed the emergency guardianship with a hand that shook just enough to make the pen leave a tremor on the paper. The law could not grant him absolution, but it could grant him the authority to keep the child safe for now. He did not imagine headlines that would flatter him. He imagined sleepless nights and small domestic rhythms that would not be easy and that would require him to relinquish some of the solitude he had perfected. He had not expected to find himself eager to do it. That night he stood in the doorway of a child's room that had been scrubbed bright and put together with more thought than he had ever applied to a boardroom. A tiny lamp made a pool of warm light. Mila clutched her bear and looked at him, eyes solemn as if she understood the enormity of being witnessed. "I like it here," she said. "It feels strong." Henry wanted to say something canonical, something that would summarize all of his newfound resolve. He found instead that the right words were small. "Then we'll stay." He closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed until the slow breath of sleep evened out her chest. In the days that followed, small rituals became the scaffolding of a new life. He took her to a dentist who specialized in trauma, who explained what might be needed in gentle, precise terms. He met with a social worker who taught him how to respond when a child retreated. Patience, not questions. Connection, not interrogation. He sat through an intake interview with CPS and learned that systems meant to protect required detailed accounting. They would want proof that his commitment was durable. He learned to hand over his schedule and to let others peek into his life in a way that made him uneasy. He signed forms, allowed home studies, and had his home inspected for hazards because the law had its own architecture of care. Through it all, Henry felt the glare of the public begin to collect at his edges. He had to manage a board meeting where the question of his suitability to continue as chair was quietly tabled. He appointed Mara, an executive who had been in the company for years and whom he trusted, to take on a more visible role. The board huffed about optics. He did not care for their indignation. He had spent his life building things that bore his name. He now wanted a legacy that was not about the size of a building, but about the children who slept well at night. Gregory returned with cautious victories, a sequence of phone calls that led to a neighborhood where women like Tasha Price operated, trading safety for the payback of a meal. They had coordinated with police to arrange a recovery of children under circumstances that would be kept as private as possible. Henry watched as officers moved with precisional procedure, as the recovered children were brought into the soft light of service vans and triage units. He did not watch photographs, he watched faces. The sight of relief unceremoniously arriving at the edge of such dark geometry was both humbling and horrifying. He did not parade the rescue as if his presence had been the cleansing rod. He knew the danger of such narratives. He had been warned by Mrs. Holloway and by social workers that this must not become a spectacle. He wrote checks for emergency placement and for longer-term therapy, but check writing was not the end. He visited the recovery center and sat in a folding chair while children colored in a way that suggested small hope. He listened without offering resolutions. In one of those rooms, a young girl looked at him with a composure older than her years and said in a steady voice, "Are you going to let us stay with you?"
It was not an accusation, but a query for commitment. Henry realized in that moment that the consequence of the DNA result was not merely an emotional wrenching, it was a moral recalibration. He could let the story be a harbinger of a photo op and go back to towers and plaques. Or he could build something that would be smaller and more durable, a household, routines, the slow ledger of affection. There were nights when he woke with the sticky taste of worry in his mouth. Would the courts grant him custodial rights? Would the city judge the networks he had used to make appointments? There would be hearings and testimonies, social workers and cross-examinations. There would be a public narrative to negotiate, a board to soothe, and a foundation to realistically reframe. He understood with a clarity that brought both fear and rare exhilaration that privilege gave him access to tools, but not to automatic moral cleanliness. He had to choose again and again to embody repair. When the lab finally delivered the full confirmation, the envelope sat heavy in his hand. The printout was objective and relentless. It listed markers and probabilities, and at the bottom, the technical language that made kinship into an empirically verifiable fact. The match was confirmed. Mila was biologically related to Eric. The paper changed nothing about the child's immediate needs, but everything about his obligations. He read the verification once, twice, and then folded the page and put it into the photograph case with Eric's picture. He did not let the confirmation become a trophy. It was, instead, a contract. There would be hearings. There would be the slow unspooling of legal obligations. There would be, if he was honest with himself, the hard work of being present. In the kitchen that evening, Mila made a fort of blankets and declared it the place where strong people sleep. Henry sat at the table and watched, the gold-rimmed plate pushed aside. He realized that what had crumbled in him was not the edifice of career, but the brittle wall of avoidance he had constructed around intimacy. It had not shattered in a dramatic single event. It had cracked slowly, then given way when a small hand reached out for a napkin and a hot bowl of soup. The coming days would demand more than intent. There would be the legal motions, the quiet work of therapy, the public statements he would have to make, the boardroom decisions that would test his priorities. There would be time for rescue operations and for the expansion of a foundation that would, he hoped, not merely fund other people's labor, but partner with those who already did it, people like Mrs. Holloway and the social workers and the neighborhood activists who had been present long before his name appeared on any plaque.
For the night, he sat with his chin in his hands and watched the traffic move below the window. Mila's breathing was a soft bell from the next room.
He thought of the phrase she had used, "It feels strong," and how strength in children is not the same as in men who build towers. For a child, strength is the absence of fear when stepping across a threshold. For Henry, strength would be to keep opening the door. At the doorway of this new life, he felt a mixture of dread and resolve. The walls he had constructed, walls of deals, of detachment, of a life arranged to avoid the messy human, had not so much collapsed as been quietly dismantled by a small voice demanding bread. He could have left the restaurant that day and gone back to the smooth, stylized life of board meetings and engraved dedications. Instead, he found himself learning the names of crayons and the particular way a scraped knee needed to be kissed. Someone asked him later if he was ready to be accountable. He thought of pen and ink, of signatures and courtrooms. Then he thought of an evening breakfast where pancakes were charred at the edges and still eaten because someone was sitting across from him waiting. He thought of a child's steady small voice calling him daddy, and the way his heart, which had been a ledger, unclenched. There would be hearings, there would be investigations into Tasha Price's network and the ambiguous complicity of people who turned their heads. There would be press and corporate tremors and public statements that tried to make sense of what had been private. But for now, Henry closed the photograph case, tucked the fragile paper into his pocket, and crossed a threshold in a house that smelled of coffee and something more enduring. Outside, in the dark, a team was organizing quietly, moving along the edges of neighborhoods where children waited without ceremony. Inside, a small girl in a faded hoodie slept with the bear stitched to her chest. Henry watched the slow rise and fall of her shoulders and promised, silently, to turn the abstractness of his philanthropy into the slow, quotidian labor of presence. If this story is speaking to you, subscribe to follow Mila and Henry's journey as they navigate custody hearings, rescue operations, and the hard work of repairing what wealth alone cannot fix. They were only at the beginning. The papers were signed, the lab confirmation was filed, the social workers had made notes and nodded. Emergency guardianship had been requested. It would have to be proven in court with the patience of many small days. Henry had moved public pieces on the board and private pieces in his life. But a question remained thick and crucial. To what extent would he be willing to dismantle not just his calendar, but the systems that had allowed children like Mila to be hidden in plain sight? The answer would not be immediate. In the quiet after the call, as the city's night traffic hummed, Henry opened the old voicemail from Eric again. He listened to his son's laugh and the promise of a quick homecoming. He let the memory, messy and luminous, soften him. He did not know how to be a perfect man. He knew only how to do one thing differently than he had before: stay. The next morning, the legal papers sat on his desk, next to a child's crayon drawing of a sun with too many rays. He smoothed the edges of the document, and then unfolded the simple art and placed it near the photograph of his son. The two objects, ridiculous together, made a crooked, hopeful altar. Outside, Gregory called with a soft, urgent voice. "We've got a lead on Tasha." "We've got a lead on Tasha," Gregory said, voice low as if the phone itself could be overheard. Henry felt the old rush of something between dread and relief, an answer to a question he had barely formed aloud. Gregory outlined names, blocks, a pattern of short stays in rented rooms, a bakery that seemed to be a front for moving children in and out like packages. It was granular and ugly in its ordinariness, the kind of intelligence that required patience and paperwork, receipts, texts, a ledger with only first names and cash amounts. They coordinated with detectives who had done this work enough to know how quickly the city could re-hide what it had found. The plan was precise and small: a late-night sweep, quietly taken children to a recovery center, privacy over spectacle. Henry insisted on a non-public operation. He wanted protection, not headlines. Gregory pressed the usual question, would Henry go on site? Henry surprised himself by saying no. He did not need to be the face of the search. He needed to be the person who kept the house safe and the small routines that let a child sleep. That night, Henry sat in a car that felt enormous and foreign, while Gregory briefed him again. Mila, tucked between blankets, dozed in the back seat, an exhausted kingdom of breath and unsteady limbs. She woke and reached for the paper bag of food Gregory handed her, an apple, a warm bun still soft from a bakery. Ate with concentration. For her, food was never a simple thing. It was a currency and a conversation. She looked up at Henry and said, frankly, "Thank you for the bun." Her voice carried the frankness of small people who know how much the world can be withheld. The raid, when it came, was less cinematic than Henry had imagined and far more human. Officers moved through a tumbled room with the clinical patience of people who had seen small faces, more terrified by sound than by sight. The children were found in narrow spaces, clutching clothes like talismans. Tasha Price was there in a doorway, faces hard and empty, the practiced calm of someone who believed in the economy of exchange, safety for obedience, food for silence. She was taken quietly and read her rights. No dramatic scuffle. The work was done with the efficiency of process and the gravity of finality. Henry watched from a safe distance as children were gently let out and wrapped in blankets. He did not take photographs.
He had learned, slowly, the difference between documenting someone's misery and tending to it. Gregory returned with evidence, a phone with a list of numbers, photocopied receipts showing cash transactions, a faded photograph of children in a park with a woman who had a hand on one child's shoulder, someone who was at once ordinary and central to the harm. It was less a cartel than a county of small cruelties, local economies of neglect that trafficked on anonymity. At the recovery center, the air smelled of disinfectant and crayons. Dr. Patel was both precise and patient. He sat with the kids and spoke in tones that acknowledged that words mattered less than being present. The center was run by people who volunteered because they could not live with the idea of indifference. Mrs. Holloway arrived with a thermos of soup and a box of pajamas, and when she held Mila's hand, the child's face slackened in a way that suggested a reserve of trust was being gently refilled. Henry moved through the rooms like someone stepping back into an old, unfamiliar ritual. He signed forms, handed over funds that would pay for immediate placements in therapy, and then made a different, quieter investment. He listened. He listened to social workers tell him how systems had failed these children, the landlord who had ignored cries, the neighbor who suspected and said nothing, the agency that had closed a file because it lacked corroboration. He listened to a young woman, barely older than his son would have been, who said simply, "We need stable places, not temporary beds." Those words stayed with him. He had imagined rescue as removal. He was learning rescue required construction, of homes, of routines, of relationships. When Gregory explained the ledger connecting small payments to different caretakers, Henry asked the question that had been growing inside him. How many of these children were unaccounted for across the city? Gregory's answer, too many to be tidy, too many for any single man to fix, made Henry feel both small and obliged. He began to translate urgency into structure. He reshuffled his world in small, concrete ways. He pulled back from daily management at the company, formally naming Mara interim CEO with a curt, efficient note that would become a talking point in the press.
He created an internal fund, but with a stipulation he insisted on aloud in meetings. The money would come with governance requirements set by community leaders, Mrs. Holloway among them. He would give the means, but relinquish the script. He signed the memo, and then, surprisingly, felt a physical lightening, as if a scaffold had been removed from his shoulders. The board bristled. Trevor, a director who had once argued for vertical growth, framed the change as risky. "We need steady leadership," he said, in a voice that suggested continuity was the highest virtue. Henry listened to the corporate fear and watched his old instinct, protect the brand, rise.
He quelled it with another habit he had not practiced: humility. "We will keep steady," he said, "but steady is not the same as moral rightness. It is time we listen to those who know this work." He appointed a community advisory board, with Mrs. Holloway co-chairing alongside a representative from a survivors' advocacy group. The tone of his announcement mattered more than the details. He would fund, he would not direct. Internally, at the house, the small scaffolding of family life rearranged. Henry learned to make a grilled cheese that did not collapse when sliced. He learned that small hands could be soothed by the same predictable sequences: bath, story, light dimmed to a crescent. Marjorie reappeared as a constant. She had a way of folding a child's pajamas into a ritual of security, each crease a promise. She taught Henry how to hide a vegetable in sauce and how not to flinch at abrupt tears in the night. Her steadiness was the quiet counterpoint to his performative wealth. The court date approached like a lit lamp in fog. Marion Hayes, the attorney, prepared him for a scene where words would be measured and gestures would count. "Judge Fulton will be looking for durability," she said. "She will want to know who will be there when the cameras leave. She will ask for proof, not platitudes." Henry compiled the proofs: background checks, home inspection reports, therapy schedules, school enrollment forms, witness statements from Marjorie, Mrs. Holloway, and Dr. Patel. He had a record of small acts, bedtime routines, Hebrew school sign-ups, dental appointments, that collectively formed a paper trail of care. The morning of the hearing, sunlight came through the courthouse windows in stripes, like piano keys. Henry kept his hands visible. He had learned in the weeks since Mila's arrival that hands told truth as much as any testimony. He placed his palms on his knees and let himself be seen. Judge Margaret Fulton presided with a reserve that suggested she had watched many lives rearrange in that room. Her questions were sober and precise. "Mr. Cole," she asked, "you have resources others lack. How will you ensure those resources continue to be used for Mila's benefit and not to insulate you from accountability?" Henry did not offer flourishes. He spoke plainly. He read from daily logs that showed routines: who took Mila to the dentist, who read to her at night, which schools had been contacted. He described the advisory board and the decision to relinquish direct control over the foundation's programming to community leaders. He admitted his failings with the kind of specificity that suggested ownership rather than performance: the missed birthdays, the voicemail he had played in the hospital corridor, the photographs tucked away. He told the court that his life had been organized around distance and that he was changing how he measured success. Mrs. Holloway and Marjorie sat beside him. Mrs. Holloway, with the quiet authority of someone who had made a career of seeing children, described the local programs that would support Mila: trauma-informed therapy, school nurturing, mentoring. She did not praise Henry as benefactor. She vouched for the plan's viability and for the community's willingness to partner. Dr. Patel testified to the child's medical needs and to the structured care plan in place. Marion Hayes, glancing at him, said simply, "We ask the court for custody so we may secure the stability she requires." The defense counsel for the state, bureaucratic, solemn, pressed for assurances that Henry's involvement would survive the glare of headlines and the gnaw of time. Judge Fulton listened, the bench a geometry of scrutiny and possibilities. At one point, Mila, who had been quiet until then, tugged Marjorie's sleeve and stood on tiptoe to whisper a small fact into Henry's ear. She had chosen a lunchbox with a bear on it and wanted pancakes the next morning. The judge watched them. She looked at Henry's hands and then at the paper in front of her. The decision, when it came, was steady and measured. The court finds that, given the evidence of sustained engagement, the available support structure, and the expressed willingness of the guardian to cede institutional control where appropriate, custody is awarded to Mr. Cole with oversight, Judge Fulton said. She set a schedule for review and for continued involvement by child services, but granted the request to provide Mila with a stable home. Her language was not an absolution, but an assignment. Henry left the courtroom with relief that tasted like an undertow, joy braided with the knowledge that legal permission was not the same as earned trust. He had a document in his bag and a list of conditions to meet. He had, more importantly, a child at home who liked pancakes shaped like bears. The public was not idle. Photographers had gathered outside the courthouse. Pieces ran with varying temperaments. Some framed the story as the fulfillment of a dramatic encounter, the billionaire who heard a child say "Daddy" and changed. Others were more skeptical, asking whether wealth could truly be reoriented. Henry absorbed the questions and let them pass. He had been both willing and wary of the optics. He decided that transparency was not the same as exhibitionism. He made a short statement emphasizing partnership and the need for system-level change. He refused interviews that sought theatrical confessions and directed journalists instead to the community partners he had empowered. The next months were a mix of ordinary household chores and extraordinary obligations. Henry published less, fed more. He sat at the edge of Mila's bed until her breathing evened. He took her to school orientation and learned the names of teachers more carefully than he had learned the names of shareholders.
He visited the recovery center, offering funds for after-school programs, and, more importantly, insisting that those funds be administered by an entity co-led by local activists and survivors. He signed legal waivers and forms until the ink blurred. He spent long hours in therapy groups, learning how to respond when Mila retreated into silence. He learned, too, the small pedagogies of parenting, the way to coax a vegetable, the correct angle for tying a shoelace, the art of asking a question and then being prepared to sit through an answer that might include tears and laughter in equal measure. The Eric Cole Foundation, named after his son and launched with the insistence it be community-led, focused on three things: immediate shelter and recovery services, funding for trauma-informed care, and an advocacy arm to push for systemic reforms in the ways the city monitored and protected vulnerable children. Henry gave the seed money and insisted that Mrs. Holloway and a small coalition of local leaders set the priorities. He created a governing board in which he had voice but not veto power over day-to-day programming. There were practical changes, too. He signed paperwork that officially transferred certain decision-making powers within his company to Mara. He appointed an executive director for the foundation from within the community organizations he was funding. He sat in rooms where community activists asked sharp questions about the ethics of incoming money,
Who controlled it? Who wrote the grants? Who decided which neighborhoods were prioritized? He sat quietly while decisions were debated and agreed to measures that sometimes meant longer timelines and less immediate media-friendly outcomes. The gesture mattered. He was intentionally ceding control. Mila's progress was uneven and luminous. Some days she laughed with the uncompromising joy of a child who found a puddle. Other days she recoiled at a sound or a crowded room. Dr. Patel explained the architecture of healing, trusts built slowly through routine, not slogans. Henry learned the language of incrementalism. He celebrated small victories, a morning when Mila asked to read first, a school play in which she said one line and beamed all night. He registered joys in the ledger of his memory, the way she folded napkins into imperfect triangles and called them decorations, the way her small hand slid into his when they crossed a street. When the police arrested Tasha Price, the legal proceedings were methodical. She was charged with multiple counts. The court process would be long and careful. Henry did not attend the arraignment. He did not need to see the woman who had been the conduit of harm. The law would take its path. He watched instead the work being done for the children she had exploited. Therapy sessions, stable placements, a program to help them reintegrate into community life.
The headlines called the case a breakthrough. Those who worked in the field called it a necessary step, but one of many. At a community center gathering months later, the city honored Eric's memory with a small ceremony. No marble plaque in a lobby, but a modest bench in a public garden where children could sit and read. The event was intentionally modest. Henry stood quietly while Mrs. Holloway spoke about the children she had seen come and go, about the necessity of local leadership. Then Mila walked up to the microphone. She was 4, and her voice, when she said, "I am not invisible," was both ordinary and extraordinary in its simplicity. It landed with a hush. The words were not a performance, they were a claim. Applause followed, real and immediate. For Henry, the line hit like water through old frost. This work was not about him. At a gala months later, the Eric Cole Foundation's first major fundraiser, Henry gave a short speech. He talked about the difference between building structures and building safety. He thanked Mrs. Holloway and the people on the front lines. He spoke without grandiloquence about the need to listen and to cede power. He set a goal for the foundation that did not revolve around the size of the grant, but around the number of neighborhoods with improved reporting systems and increased funding for local after-school programs. He also announced a pilot program that would partner with schools to train staff in trauma response and to fund stable housing for families at risk. His words were not a curtain call, they were an invitation. He dedicated the foundation's first major grant to neighborhood-run programs and named Mrs. Holloway as co-chair. The press photographed the moment because photographs like neat narratives. But inside the room, Henry watched as leaders from different communities signed the grant agreements themselves. He felt, for perhaps the first time publicly, like a funder who had learned the shape of humility. The work of parenting continued to teach him. One morning, Mila refused her oatmeal. She wanted instead the pancakes shaped like bears she had insisted on the week before. Henry made them with exaggerated care. He burned the 3rd batch, but did not scold himself. Mila declared them just right, as if only she understood that the world could be tender and imperfect at once. They sat at the kitchen table, a small kingdom, Marjorie humming quietly in the background. Henry watched the sunlight through the window catch the powdered sugar in little diamonds. He thought of thresholds again. How a child crossing a threshold into a home needed the door held steady. There were setbacks. A minor scandal emerged when a former executive suggested the foundation's move to community governance was performative.
A set of donors withdrew, choosing the comfort of distance over messy partnership. Henry felt the sting of betrayal and the steadiness of choice. He let the donors go. He called fewer people to reassure than he had once called to placate. In private, he returned often to the leather photograph case with Eric's picture and the printed DNA confirmation. He kept them near the child's crayon drawing of a sun with too many rays. They were evidence of a particular grief and of a particular responsibility. He read Eric's old voicemail sometimes and played it slowly, as if to keep a living voice present at the margins of their new life. Years, measured in smaller increments than he had expected, passed. The advisory board met regularly. The foundation funded a small network of recovery homes and a clinic that specialized in pediatric trauma. Funding priorities were set by people who had been living the problem long before his name reached the newspapers. He met with city officials and asked for changes in reporting procedures and for more resources for neighborhood programs. He used his privilege not to dominate the conversation, but to open doors for those who had been denied access. One late afternoon, Henry climbed the rooftop of his building. The city lay in a soft gold, the skyline a familiar set of edges. Mila appeared at his side, tiny and determined, holding her bear. She had collected a stick and declared it a wand that makes things strong. He smiled and took her hand. The rooftop, once a place of solitudes and solitary decisions, had become a place of small meetings, the two of them, their conversation punctuated by the distant noise of life. "You said once," Mila said, in the plain way children say things that complicate adults, "that strong means not being scared at the door." He thought of the restaurant, of the napkin on the table, of the way her small hand had first reached out. "Yes," he said, "I said that." She considered the light, then looked at him. "Will you keep standing there?" she asked, pointing to the doorway in the distance that framed the city like a painting. He felt the old architecture of avoidance stir and then settle into something that looked like a plan. "Yes," he said, "I'll keep standing there." He meant it in a way that had little to do with heroics and everything to do with a daily, relentless attention, going to meetings, reading reports, listening to people who had been damaged by the systems his money could sometimes shield. He meant it in the smallness of carrying laundry down to the basement, of making soup when someone was sick, of taking calls at midnight to plan a school's after-hour safety meeting. The walls that had once kept everything at a distance had not so much crumbled as been unbuilt, brick by routine and by stubborn presence. In the months that followed, other children found safe places. Some arrived by referral from social services. Others were the quiet additions who showed up at the recovery center and were slowly moved into foster care or into extended family. Henry insisted on privacy for their transitions. He made sure the foundation's resources went where they were needed, to therapy hours, to tutors, to small repairs in apartments that made a threshold feel like a home. He insisted, again and again, that the community leaders he had asked to steer the programs be given not just a grant, but decision-making power. At a modest ceremony some time later, the city unveiled a small plaque in a community garden honoring children who had endured abuse and the local leaders who had protected them. The plaque included, simply, a line about visibility, that every child deserves to be seen. Henry read the words and felt a quietness that was not triumph, but a steady willingness to keep the work. He knew the phrase alone did not change systems. The work did. Mila grew. Her small sentences gained nuance. She corrected people who called her brave without knowing anything of the dull moments of repair. When she was given opportunities to speak at community meetings, she did so in the way children do, plain and surprising. "I'm tired of being hidden," she once said to a small group, "and I like it when people make room." The room made room. It was not spectacle, it was practice. Henry kept photographs of those early days in a drawer, the napkin from the restaurant, the lab printout, Eric's picture, the child's first crayon sun. He kept them as reminders that a life could be altered by a single human request and then remade by the relentless accumulation of small acts. He sat sometimes at the kitchen table and watched Mila teach a new foster child how to fold a napkin into a triangle. He watched the simplicity of attention remap a household. When people asked him what had changed most, he would say, simply, "I learned to be ordinary." It was not meant as a dismissal of the responsibilities he still bore. It was an admission that life's real labor was not found in press releases or named buildings, but in the repetition of small tasks. There were policy victories, too. The Foundation's advocacy helped fund a city pilot that trained school staff in trauma response and increased staffing for neighborhood social workers. Not every proposal passed on the first try. Bills moved slowly, compromised in committee. Henry learned to accept that systems changed in increments, often messy and never as dramatic as headlines suggested. He gave money and time to people who had been fighting those fights before his name lent them visibility. He did not attempt to take credit. When the Foundation funded a new crisis hotline, he insisted the number be publicized beside local storefronts and in community centers, not just in glossy brochures. In the quiet of home, the ordinary rituals remained the measure of his change. He learned to braid hair clumsily and to ask for help when he could not. He spent evenings at PTA meetings where he listened to parents, some tired, some angry, some hopeful. He sat in groups where survivors told their stories and where policy experts translated pain into statutes. He learned to be present in rooms where he was not the expert, but a listener. One evening, long after the initial headlines had faded, Mila arranged the living room cushions into a fort and crowned Henry with a paper hat. She fed him imaginary soup with a wooden spoon, and then, when the game was done, cuddled close. "You stayed," she said, a small statement of fact that carried a whole history. He kissed her forehead and felt, rather than declared, an answer. Staying, he had learned, was not simply a matter of presence, but of surrender. Surrender of ego, of the neat narratives he used to tell himself about being a man who solved problems with checks and grand gestures. He had surrendered power in ways that allowed others to lead. The city's work was far from done. Children continued to be invisible in corners where systems were thin. But the Foundation's small network of programs began to show a pattern: quicker reporting, better trauma response, more stable placements. Henry's name appeared less often in press releases. Mrs. Holloway and community leaders appeared more. He would sometimes watch the news and feel the old reflex to explain and to control. He would instead call the Foundation director and ask what the community needed. He had learned a new discipline. Years later, at a modest community celebration, a plaque was unveiled in Eric's name, not outside a corporate headquarters, but in a school garden where children planted seeds. Henry stood quietly, Marjorie at his side, Gregory nearby with a small smile that suggested relief. Mila, older now, took the microphone for a minute and said, not to a camera, but to the people who had been holding the work, "We are here. We are not invisible." The crowd cheered in a way that felt unforced. When the event ended, Henry walked Mila to the doorway of her classroom. The threshold looked like any other doorway, and yet it had become for him a symbol of what he owed, the promise to hold that space steady for others. He placed his hand on the jamb and felt the small warmth of a place that meant belonging. Some nights, when the city was quiet and the dishes were stacked, and the laundry hummed, Henry would take out the leather case, the photograph of Eric, and the folded DNA printout. He would set them beside the crayon sun and breathe in the mixture of grief and repair. He would sometimes read the old voicemail, not in search of satisfaction, but as a reminder of what had been begun. The transformation was not a monument. It was a life rearranged by a child who had simply asked for bread. The world, for Henry, had gone from an order of things to an order of people. He had learned the slow work of making a place strong. If this story moved you, please share it to raise awareness about child exploitation and to support community-based child advocacy.
There are links in the description where you can find more information and ways to help.